Welcome to the debut of the Kerouac Project Book Club. And I am John King. I'm the host of the Drunken Odyssey podcast, which comes out every week if I'm feeling okay. And I'm quite happy to be joined by my publisher and friend, Matthew Peters.
Hi, I'm Matt Peters. I'm the publisher behind Beating Windward Press, and I typically publish, maybe one book a year at this point if I'm feeling like it. But at my height, I was doing about 3 or 4 books a year. I've got about 28, 29 books out at this point.
And you tend to do cross-genre, weird stuff.
Yeah, typically books that are well-written but don't have a large target audience. Agents and editors tend to tell the writers, I love it, but I don't know how I would sell it. So as a idiotic business person, I'm like, that's perfect for me. I'll take that. It's something that's really hard to sell. But as a reader, I like books that are different from all the same stuff I've been reading my whole life.
And if you were around in the 50s, maybe the Beat Generation would have been up your alley.
Possibly, yes. Hadn't thought of that. Thanks for first curveball of the day. Instantly, my brain was going, no, I probably would have been off with Junky doing, stealing things and selling it for junk.
Yeah, if you had the wherewithal to have a press in the 50s, which is, a couple of if steep, I think. We've been traveling a bunch lately together and just sort of organically having conversations about William S. Burroughs. So I thought, I bet I could get a podcast out of this, and I bet we could theme it for the Kerouac Project of Orlando. So this is the house where Jack Kerouac lived when On the Road came out, and where he wrote the first draft of the Dharma Bums on a scroll because taking paper out of the typewriter took too damn long. And if this series goes well, about every 6 weeks or so, we're going to have a new installment where we're going to cover William S. Burroughs' first 4 books, starting with his debut, Junky, which he started writing in 1950 and was published by Ace Books in 1953, leading then to Queer, leading then to Inner Zone, leading then to The Phantasmagoria of Naked Lunch. And then I'll have to assess my mental health at that point.
And I think part of your idea came out of this when I talked about the books as a set, because I've never really heard too many people talk about it as a set. It's just, I read them all and they logically flow together as a set. And I think that enticed you to want to read them all as a set.
Yeah, so it's been, I think, like 2 decades since I delved into Burroughs. I am a literary scholar, although I do suspect Matt is way more prepared than I am today.
I have notes in front of me and little tabs in the book. It's only because I'm intimidated by John being a literary scholar, and I'm just some schmuck that likes, stories about drugs and giant insects.
Sometimes being a literary scholar just means I'm a big prick who likes the same things. So we're going to talk for, half hour, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions so that the discussion part will be open to everybody. But I thought maybe Matt and I can lay down some context and share our thoughts about the novel. So
I kind of feel like we should explain that whole it's 4 books in a series thing that most people don't realize.
And the floor is yours.
Okay. So my main evidence for this, Junky came out, publication history, Junky came out in 52, 53, and then Naked Lunch came out in 59. Queer came out in the 1980s, if I'm remembering correctly, and then I'm not really sure when Inner Zone came out. So they weren't published in series. But if you look at the books, the Junky and Queer were written under the pseudonym William Lee. William Lee is the main character of Naked Lunch, which was written by William Burroughs. And Inner Zone is also credited and written by William Burroughs. And just in my weird way of thinking of things, it just flows logically of, William Lee was writing Junky and he was writing Queer about his experiences. Burroughs goes to Inner Zone and goes through this sort of catharsis or metamorphosis, turning into the William Burroughs he would eventually be. which is the transformation. Inner Zone starts off very straightforward and comprehensive or comprehensible, and then by the end of it, it's this gigantic rant that, in my opinion, is way worse than anything that happens in Naked Lunch. But then you get Naked Lunch at the end of it, so that's kind of how I see it, as a not quite a trilogy, but quadrology.
Quadrology,
but a 4-book series.
And you can see his creative development.
Yes. So
from a relatively traditional writer to a lunatic.
Yes, to books that are very hard for most people to read and enjoy, which is, again, why John wanted to start with Junky, because it probably is the most accessible, straightforward book.
And contrary to the advertising, we don't actually have any heroin to share.
You told me not to bring any.
Shh. This is a book I knew about and hadn't read. So it was kind of fun and interesting to see what is it like when William S. Burroughs is still writing in a way that feels traditional. To me, it's a little bit like reading Hell's Angels by Hunter S. Thompson, where I would say more than half of that book, that feels like a journalist on assignment writing a profile about a motorcycle gang. And then you've got moments in there where you could see, oh, this is what he's going to become in later books. He's learning how to become something more than a journalist. And, you could see the inklings of what would become the new journalism, where Hunter Thompson isn't invisible in the story. Hunter Thompson is the story. And his ability to understand the Hells Angels by doing everything other than completely becoming one is the story, so that he can understand the, the mentality of being in that group, as opposed to being a journalist with a tie, always being on the opposite side of the equation. He made himself inside the equation. And I feel like Junky it's an alarming book unless you know his later career.
Yeah, it was shocking at the time because it was dealing with heroin and drug addiction and crime to obtain the drugs. As a publisher or an editor, I sat down and I've enjoyed the book before, but I said, okay, well, if I was to teach this book or dissect it, how would I talk about it? Like, what kind of book is this? And what John was hinting at, it's not a straightforward, it is a straightforward narrative, but it doesn't have a character arc to it. It's not a story of a character on a journey. It's much more of an anthropological study of intravenous opiate users and street criminals in the late 1940s than it is like a traditional character arc. And at the time, when he was at Columbia and met Kerouac and Ginsberg and Lucian Carr and everybody, he was studying anthropology. That's he was going to grad school for anthropology. It could also be considered a personal narrative or a confessional novel, although he's not very... The character of William Lee isn't very remorseful about anything. He's just presenting everything very straightforward. This is my experience. This is how I got the first, heroin that I encountered, or morphine at the time. This is how I got it. This is, how I shot it up. This is the syringe that I used. It wasn't a typical hypodermic needle. This is how I got more of it. This is how long it took to get hooked on it. It's very almost clinical and removed and journalistic, as you're saying. I wanted to go with the original subtitle was Confessions of an Unredeemed Drug Addict. But that was put on there by the publisher and was not Burroughs' intention at all, or his feel about it. He just called it his book about junk.
And when it was published by Ace Books, it was half the book, right? It was 2 books in one. And they really hedged their bets. So there is a tradition of exploitational literature, and I presume it's similar to film. I'm much more familiar with exploitation films.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I was a teenage, runaway, or I was a Mexican drug mule or whatever. It's in that vein of...
Yeah, and the more scandalous of those pretended usually to be educational. Oh, this is what it's like to be a sex fiend. Here are naked ladies. Now remember, this is educational. You can't be mad at us. This is educational. And in the films of Russ Meyer, seldom do they claim to be educational, but there's a very clear moral point that's tacked on to the end of every movie, so that you're like, oh yes, the guilty have been punished. It's a shame they did all those things we enjoyed watching for an hour and a half. And I think there's that element to Junky. It's difficult to imagine William S. Burroughs deliberately writing towards that. I don't think he did. But the publisher, right, it was a former FBI agent, had the other text, and it was something they reprinted from the 40s. But they were trying to shore up their bona fides as, having a moral purpose for this book.
And it was also, the first 20 or so books that Ace Books did were double packed like that. And they were actually flipped over. So you would always be looking at it correctly. When you got to the other book, you could, you flipped over to the back and then it was upside down. You had to turn it over to sandwich the books together like that. But yeah, the first 20 or so books were put together like that.
And the cover of Junky was someone taking a woman hostage?
No, it was the buxom blonde, like desperately trying to hold on to the man as he's like going out to get more junk type thing. But very pulp cover, red dress, big flowy blonde hair, drugs on a side table in the front of the image.
In a future book cover, she goes to the detective agency for the hard-boiled story.
Yes. Should we talk about the plot, probably, for people that haven't read the book? We're talking like people...
Is there a plot?
Well, sequence of events.
There's a progression. Okay.
He comes across some friend of his that is good at stealing stuff. He's a full-time thief, a hardworking thief, he calls him in the book. Gets boxes of morphine syrettes, which are like single-use little needles. He describes it as like a toothpaste tube. And asks William Lee to help him sell it. And he ends up selling it to some junkies after a couple of connections. And he ends up using it. Eventually, he kind of sees, or he's curious about it, and ends up using it and does a lot of kind of the journalistic thing of saying, I wasn't hooked right away. That's not the way most drugs work. It takes months and months and months of using it every single day to develop a habit. And then it takes you a couple of habits before you're a full-blown addict. A lot of the book, he's debunking kind of the drug hysteria and a lot of the misinformation out there about drugs. Right away, the very first instance where he's shooting up, they talk about, oh, don't worry about air bubbles. That's bullshit. You don't have to, if air bubbles would kill you, there aren't any junkies alive. And then he starts escalating where he starts using more and more. And then the character has a trust fund, basically. So he's getting $150 a month from his family, and his habit starts exceeding his trust fund. So then he has to start working, sometimes, mugging or not mugging, but going through the pockets of drunks in the subway. So people would pass out and they'd steal their wallet and things like that, in addition to other little petty scams. Eventually, of course, gets busted for faking doctor's prescriptions, goes in to get a cure in a rehab facility, comes out of it, ends up going to, moving locations. I'm speeding up the plot at this point. Ends up in Texas, ends up in New Orleans, continually getting in more and more trouble, just leaving the state to avoid prosecution, and eventually ends up in Mexico City, where he's finally trying to get off of junk, and ends up just making his life worse by switching over to alcohol. And kind of it ends in this really weird way where he hears about this other drug somewhere in South America, Yahe, and he thinks maybe this is the drug that will fill the hole in my heart that I've been wanting to fill with drugs, morphine and heroin. And the ending kind of, he just is going off to South America in search of a better drug. Yeah. That fairly accurate?
Yeah.
I mean, I skipped
yeah.
a lot of good juicy bits, but
Well, and it, reminds me a little bit of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Follow me here.
I'm like, right, yeah.
So, Uncle Tom's Cabin, like, it's not a good book. But in discussing the slavery issue as it existed at the time, it kind of hit every single point. Like, if you're the political arguments around, like, it's very systematic in the way that through story it explores all the problems of slavery and kind of pushes back against the pro-slavery narratives. Well, most slavers aren't that bad, and the book, no matter what you might want to think, it kind of covers every single node of slavery. And so he cleans up a couple times
Yep.
in the book, and occasionally, like, he'll just stop and then offer commentary about the way the government looks at drugs and the way that, society looks at drugs, the way that cops look at drugs, which is not necessarily the same as the legal situation with drugs. And kind of along the way, right, it's kind of a real education.
Yeah. It's with, I would say, a balanced education. He's not glamorizing it. He's really showing, like, how horrible and desperate a corner you're putting yourself in if you choose to be, not choose to become addicted, but choose to use this and accidentally get addicted. And that's one of the themes in the very beginning is, this guy Roy who's shooting him up is telling him, like, everybody thinks they can handle it. They can't handle it. You're going to wake up one day and realize you're addicted because you've just used too much too often, and then you're stuck. And that's one of the things. And it's, he'll get clean and he'll run into somebody. He runs in, I think they're in New Orleans, and he runs in, he's dealing with a lawyer, and there's another guy waiting at the lawyer's office in New Orleans. And that guy is also a junkie, and they kind of recognize each other, and they're talking, and I get the impression they're both clean. And the other junkie just kind of looks at him and is like, you want to go score? Like, we're both junkies. Let's just go get high. And they're just like, without a thought, yeah, let's go score. And it's almost like the opportunity presents itself, and it's too hard to say no a lot of the time.
And it's a question I think he keeps open for a big chunk of the book is, why is he doing this? When Irvine Welsh did Train Spotting, he's very clear up front. Okay, the world that the middle class wants everyone to have is insupportable and awful. And the idea of making yourself miserable so that you could be slightly less miserable wanting all of these lame things makes heroin seem like a great thing.
And Welsh actually talks about the pleasure you get from it. Burrough mentions its relaxing effects and feeling like you're floating in salt water. But after that, he doesn't really talk about the pleasure. He talks about the relief from the pain of withdrawal. And that's like all you get out of it is it stops the withdrawal pain. But yeah, Welsh in Train Spotting, it's like, it's take the best orgasm you've ever had and multiply it times 10,000. He's very upfront, like, this is why we do it. It feels good. But there's not that sort of glamorization in Junky.
No romanticism about the drug use at all. And there's no, like, no matter how awful it gets for him, there's no self-pity there, and he doesn't get on his high horse about politics either. Like, he can point out the political problems without, getting angry about it in a personal way.
Except for one point. He gets so... in Kentucky and Louisiana at the time, they made a law that it was illegal to be an addict. And they didn't specify what an addict was.
You look like an addict.
Yeah, you look like an addict. And they talks about the cops stopping them and telling them to roll up their sleeves. And if they find old track marks, they just arrest them for being an addict. You don't have to have any, drugs on you. And he talks about the I'm going to say police state of it, but the taking the junkies and making them out to be a threat. There's a word for that, and I'm forgetting what it is. But the singling out of the junkies and saying, okay, this is bad. We got to do something. Let's take away their rights so that we can stop this horrible drug scourge that's happening. And then Burroughs comments that taking away the governments and police states use that to try out new police state laws and get people used to them. Going back to referring to the Nazis doing it with the Jews, and it being done with, I'm looking for my notes because I have this in my notes, John, somewhere. Yeah. Foucault. Anyway. Wow, how do I not have that in my note? I know I have it in my note. Oh, the idea of the anti-drug hysteria being used to control people out of fear by creating a common enemy of junkies like the Nazis did with the Jews in World War II, and to establish dictatorial police states against junkies that can then be used against regular citizens. On page 142, I cited my fucking source. And then being a drug addict is made illegal in Louisiana. That happens on page 66.
Yeah, so your existence is something. Is the crime.
Right. So, but Burroughs was very much, he didn't care what anybody else did, and he wanted everybody else to respect him the same way. Don't give a shit what I do.
A nice, well-adjusted libertarian.
Yeah, basically. Very much libertarian. I'm going to do whatever the hell I want to do. You do whatever the hell you want to do. But if you infringe on me, I'm going to shoot you or stab you.
Well, he describes those laws in such a way where I feel like he's not outraged, but it's described in such a way where, like, I feel outraged. Like, if he was too mad about it, I would just go, okay, so there's an angry junkie who, like, but, like, by stating it calmly, I'm like, yeah, how dare they do that? Like,
I guess it is fairly calm and straightforward in the book. I'm getting this probably out of his bio and videos of footage of Burroughs ranting and raving about stuff.
Kind of like, in the documentary, one of the documentaries, or maybe all of them, right? He's in his bunker. That's what he called it.
Literally, he had a basement, an old YMCA.
And he's like showing off all his weapons. Like, if someone messes with me, all right, this is what I'm going to use. And it's like, there's not a long history of people messing with him. And yet he had an arsenal, like, ready. And there you're like, all right, it seems kind of nutty there.
Which is a great, he's not, he wouldn't say he was gay or homosexual. He's
labels.
He just because of labels, but he's not your typical, he's not your sissy, sissy queer, as you would call it in the book. He's always armed. In Mexico, he loses like 3 guns in a couple of chapters. Like, how many guns do you have that you lost another gun? He's just very well armed. He's always got knives and guns and rifles and shotguns and everything. The opening scene, he's trying to sell a Tommy gun with the morphine syrettes. I'm amazed he didn't keep the Tommy gun for himself.
It's hard to conceal.
It is hard to conceal. There was one of the videos was talking about when he was older and living in Lawrence, Kansas in the last decade of his life. He was just always armed, but he was having to go to like doctor's appointments and things, and he was making people nervous, like this old man with this big rifle or this big pistol strapped to him. So the compromise, him and his manager, handler type people, was like, okay, you can carry your little Dillinger, your little single shot 22 Dillinger, so you at least have a weapon on you and you feel good, you feel safe, but you're not openly carrying, pistols around.
So, do you think the book's funny?
Junky isn't particularly funny. It's got its moments, but I think Naked Lunch is hilarious. So, by comparison.
Well, all right. So, Naked Lunch has routines where, like, you can isolate them. In fact, they have been isolated. If you've seen or heard William S. Burroughs doing a funny bit or just a weird, upsetting story that's kind of funny in a very bleak way, it's probably extracted from Naked Lunch. But I think some of the, like, when he's trying to pickpocket alcoholics on the subway with his friend, and they're like yelling at each other, and they're so close to getting caught, and it's
it's a little
I
bit
found
of a,
it hysterical, and Burroughs is not putting his thumb on the scale to make it funnier, but just the pathetic weirdness, these sort of
it almost has a Saturday Night Live skit to it, right? These two
Yeah.
inept junkies trying to rip off, get a wallet out of a guy, but he's laying on his coat in such a way, like that's the problem. The guy's laying on his coat, they can't get to the wallet. So, William Lee's partner is telling him to like lean into him, like, I'm going to shove you and then we'll jostle him and we can get him to move so it looks like an accident so they can steal this guy's wallet. There's definitely humorous scenes. Junky was much more informative to me. I probably found it funnier when I read it the first time when I was in my early 20s, but very much more informative as far as just how things worked and what New York was like in the post-war era.
Yeah, I found it. Knowing what's coming later, it's not the funniest stuff, but I don't know. I found, and maybe I just find this stuff funny. There are a lot of memoirs about people who've had drug issues and alcoholism issues, and once they're okay, some of the stuff they go through and some of the episodes they have are just hysterical. Like, it does help knowing, okay, William Lee is alive. He's not in jail at the time that he's writing this. So I could laugh a little bit at some of the antics and some of the problems that are going on. And occasionally, and I think this is one of the thrills of reading William S. Burroughs, right? It's amoral.
Yeah.
Which means if I'm laughing at something, I do implicate myself. And I do get to think, okay, am I a bad person for laughing at this? And I usually answer no, but I do think about it.
Yeah, and that's the humor that I find. People being inappropriate, especially in situations where they should be appropriate or they should be behaving themselves. People being inappropriate or saying things that you shouldn't say or you shouldn't even utter or think. Burroughs is great at that. Like, just that's the phrases and the things that come out of his characters' mouths. It's that surprise of like, oh my God, somebody said that, or somebody put it that way, or somebody thought of it in that way, that I enjoy a lot. That's where I get a lot of the enjoyment out of Burroughs. It's kind of like watching the only things I can think of is the movie Thank You for Smoking, where every single person in the movie is a horrible person, but that's what makes it funny. Or the cartoon show Archer, where again, everybody in it is just a horrible person. And I just find that entertaining because you're like, what outlandish thing are they going to say now?
Yeah, and he had a resurgence in the 70s, Burroughs did. In part, I think, when punk rock became a powerful cultural movement, like small, but I think we're still feeling the echoes from punk, right? A group will just say, okay, we're going to come up with a song called God Save the Queen, and we mean the opposite. And that'll be the theme song for the Jubilee. And it's like, what? So with the rise of punk, they found recordings of Burroughs, and it's like, oh, we love this guy.
Yeah, so
he didn't necessarily love them.
No. There's a band called Fear that is, when you look at their lyrics and you look at their antics, you're like, oh my God, they're such horrible assholes. But you look at Lee Ving, the lead singer, and he was like, I went to a punk show and you can say anything and people cheer. You can do anything. So he was just misbehaving to misbehave, right? He was like, I can do it and the audience loves it. I can, call them all bastards and throw my drink at them and they just cheer. This is wonderful, which is half of what I think that band is getting at.
So yeah, Ted Morgan in this biography, Literary Outlaw, gets at something, which is William S. Burroughs was never really part of the literary establishment.
Yeah.
He did teach at a university, but, and don't get me wrong, I would have attended every lecture if I could. But he would just talk and talk and talk. And considering how, I don't know, structureless his storytelling tends to be, you might wonder, all right, what exactly are you supposed to learn from him if you're a creative writer? One of my mentors was a student of his in New York, and he would just talk, and then, all right, Allen Ginsberg might just show up and talk one day, and William Burroughs would listen, and then you would submit some work. And so to Chuck, William wrote something. I remember the story I was told was it was addressed Charles, right? Like, all right, his name was Chuck, but he is just going by the roster. You know, we see that very much at play here in Junky. This outlaw sense, this outsider sense of being a literary writer. And it's probably what joins him with the other Beat Generation writers, since he tended to wear suits. So, I mean, he looked like a narc.
Right, and that was Hunky's or Herbert in the book. His first impression is they brought this guy over to sell, this ungodly amount, like 75, doses of morphine, and Hunky is. Hello.
Hey there.
He's in a suit with a fedora and nice clothes because he's coming from a well-to-do family, and he has this sort of Southern gentleman bearing or demeanor to him. And the character of Herbert looks at him and is like, this guy's a narc, and just is like, I'm not interested, and walks out of the room, like just not buying anything from that guy.
So even among the literary outlaws, he was an outlaw. Like he was an outsider even in that group.
He talks about that a little bit in the prologue, or maybe just everything else I've read from him. But, he always felt out of place. He didn't feel accepted by traditional status quo society, especially the sort of rich upper class society he was raised in St. Louis. Then on top of that, being gay and having these divergent interests in, just weird psychic phenomena and conspiracies, and he just, I can imagine him being really, really awkward at a cocktail party. Somebody's trying to talk about sports, and he's like, so there's these things called orgons, and if you can collect them out of the atmosphere and concentrate them in your body, it will fight cancer, right? And just people being like, ooh, and turning away from him. So I think he always had that outsider-ness to him, but it was so early, especially for the homosexuality, that where Ginsberg was just like, screw it, I'm gay, Burroughs was like, I'm not gay, I just like to sleep with boys, It's like, but he definitely has that outsider. I don't know. I guess literary is so wide. There were definitely people that appreciated him and enjoyed him, but they also might be considered literary outsiders. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, in academic circles now, he is respected, not necessarily
Somewhat.
liked.
Yeah.
And yet, outside of the academic world, among the freaks, he's beloved.
By some, yeah. There's a lot of, he didn't fit neatly into a box. So there's definitely a lot of people that are like, they're not going to like or agree with a lot of things he did. And that's one of the things, by today's standards, he's using the word queer and faggot like crazy in this. Being gay, I mean, he never comes out. It's weird. This is one of the things with Junky, especially after reading so much of his work that is unapologetically homosexual and describing sex acts and glorifying penises and balls and ejaculate and all sorts of stuff. For him to fly so under the radar and Junky about it, he talks about going to gay bars, but it's like he just kind of happened to end up in a gay bar. Well, you happen to kind of end up in a gay bar in every single city you go to. Like what, and there's finally it gets to New Orleans and he talks about actually trying to hook up with a guy and, go back to a hotel. And I think the only reason he mentions it is because he gets ripped off. The guy takes his money and slips out the side door of the hotel. and he lost, the $10 for the room and the boy. And until you get almost to the end, and then there's a part where he's in Mexico City where he's just like, oh, let me lay out my routine with the boys, and it's almost jarring at that point because he's been so under the radar with it for most of the book. Anyway, I forget what my point was at the beginning on that.
Well,
but just
in the gay community, he was an outsider because if you say, and I'm sure this wasn't a phrase, the gay community in the 40s when these events were happening, or in the early 50s when he was writing about it. If you say that, oh, I'm part of the gay community, it seems to imply, okay, there are these things you know about me, and like you could just check that, and it's like, right, he's signing up for the sex.
Yeah, he was just
maybe
interested in the sex.
Nothing else.
Yeah, it's
So he, he's really resistant to labels, and I've got a brief anecdote about my ability to kind of understand that because I'm a fan of the blues. And I can tell you that because you're my friends. But in grad school, this got around, apparently, I don't know how, but one of my, a white woman, her name technically wasn't Karen, but she goes, oh, John, you're a fan of the blues, aren't you? I heard you're a fan of the blues. And my heart sank and my mind shrank, and I did not want to have this conversation.
It's not the sum total of your identity.
Well, there's that. And I'm like, okay, so what do you like? And I'm like wincing. And she goes, oh, I love Eric Clapton and Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I'm like, yeah, no, those two white people are certainly the core of the blues. And everyone else is just clinging on. And, and Stevie's like a solid choice. Like Eric Clapton, it's like, okay, so it's mostly rock and roll with some blues in there when he feels like it. And, so I felt dirty just having that conversation that I did not consent to have. And, it's not that it's not that I wanted to disrespect those musicians, but, right, I'm in an awkward position to be a blues fan, I think. And I'm kind of okay talking about it, provided everybody knows, right, if you're white, that it's a little bit of an awkward position. Like, I don't make any apologies for what I like. But if I have to have like a white-centric conversation about it, like, are we back in the 19th century?
Well, you just have to say you like Irish drinking songs. It's the same subject matter. It's just different. It's okay.
But you're about to make a much more germane point, I think, which was...
Germane? What's the Third Reich have to do with it? Sorry. Okay. That was me being anti-intellectual, I guess.
Jermaine
so
Jackson.
I was just going to get back to trying to get back to the faggots, damn it. In the introduction, he talks about his time before he started junk. And he's talking about, by accident, I met some rich homosexuals of the international queer set who cruise around the world bumping into each other in queer joints from New York to Cairo. I saw a way of life, a vocabulary, references, a whole symbol system, as the sociologists say. But these people were jerks for the most part, and after an initial period of fascination, I cooled off on the setup. It just took me a while to find that spot to read it. I forget now why I was reading it. And actually, in his bio, it is a fascinating period of his life because he makes it sound like, oh, I hung out with him for a couple of weeks. No, he did it for a couple of years and traveled around Europe. And his first wife that he marries, basically to help her escape Nazi persecution, was in that international queer set. She was, I guess the Burroughs term would have been a fag hag. But a sponsor of the arts and that type of thing. And she was being forced to go back to Germany because her visa had expired. But as a Jew, if she went back to Germany, she was totally fucked. So she was like, will you marry me so I can get to America? And he was like, sure. And just totally pissed off his parents. But that was his first marriage, which usually is just barely ever mentioned in anything about him.
How do you feel about this edition, right? We're reading the same edition, the 50th anniversary definitive edition. It's like, oh, is there another cut of Blade Runner?
It's that kind of thing. Well, they talk about it in the introduction, John. If you would read that shit, they put it in the book for a reason. There was the censored and altered version. When he turned in the first manuscript, Ace Books changed a lot of his language. Either they didn't understand it or they were trying to soften it. And then they were also adding in these footnotes that said, this is just the author's belief, medical and governmental studies say otherwise. And he was really, really pissed about that. But he sent a letter just detailing everything that they screwed up in his book or changed. And so then when he got the rights back, I think in 1977, that was the second version where he was able to put back in or correct a lot of things he wanted to do. And then the original manuscript was thought lost, but after he and Ginsberg's death, they found the original manuscript in Ginsberg's stuff at Columbia and kind of were able to cobble together what they're calling this definitive edition, which is, the stuff he wanted cut out of it, the stuff he wanted in there, and replacing just some censored bits and things like that.
Yeah, and the editor had corrected, all right, I'm using scare quotes here, some of the slang to make it, correct. And it's like, you just made it sound like he doesn't know what he's talking about to the people who are in the drug culture because you thought you knew better. How many times have you ever thought, autocorrect, I'm going to slap you so hard?
He was ducking this young boy. No, that's not what he was doing. Like, he was not ducking anybody. Totally different context. But yeah, they've got some of those corrections in the back of the book. Unfortunately, the first time I read it was, 97. So it's been 30 years since I couldn't tell you the differences between the first time I read Junky and this version of it. It all seems about the same, nothing struck me as like, oh, that's a whole new part that I don't ever remember being in there. But yeah, so if you buy a really used copy, an older used copy, it might be the 77 version. You probably aren't going to find the 1952 or 53 version out there at this point.
Pretty pricey.
Yep. Did you find the part where they're censoring the stuff?
No, no. But the appendices list like multiple introductions, which I guess is fine if you're a completionist. But once you've read 3 in a row, I don't know. I feel like
I read them all, damn it. I was... Go ahead, keep talking.
Ginsberg has one. The publisher, the editor at Ace Books who selected the book is named Carl Solomon, and he's the person that Allen Ginsberg dedicated Howl to. So he was friends with Allen Ginsberg, and so Allen Ginsberg on multiple occasions behaved as William S. Burroughs' agent, and somehow, found a way to claw their way into the literary world.
Yeah, which for young writers, that's just the way you got to do it. It's a weird, they say who you know, but it's really who's in your network, who have you made friends with, be active in the scene. You can't wait for people to come find you. They were using any advantage they could. My friend's uncle got this publishing company for pulp novels. Let's see if he can help us break in. Ginsberg got sold or got Howl published because he was reading at events in San Francisco, and Ferlinghetti happened to be at the event and loved the poem. But if Ginsberg was just sitting in his room not doing anything with it, he never would have gotten discovered.
I think I'll read the last 2 pages of the novel.
Okay.
Because I think, all right, why do people do drugs? He addresses that, and so... And, all right, here's where I solemnly swear I will not do an impression of William S. Burroughs. All right. When you give up junk, you give up a way of life. I've seen junkies kick and hit the lush and wind up dead in a few years. Suicide is frequent among ex-junkies. Why does a junkie quit? Junk of his own will. You never know the answer to that question. No conscious tabulation of the disadvantages and horrors of junk gives you the emotional drive to kick. The decision to quit junk is a cellular decision. And once you have decided to quit, you cannot go back to junk permanently any more than you could stay away from it before. Like a man who has been away a long time, you see things different when you return from junk. I read about a drug called Yahweh used by Indians in the headwaters of the Amazon. Yahweh is supposed to increase telepathic sensitivity. A Colombian scientist isolated from Yahweh a drug he calls telepathine. I know from my own experience that telepathy is a fact. I have no interest in proving telepathy or anything to anybody. I do want usable knowledge of telepathy. What I look for in any relationship is contact on the nonverbal level of intuition and feeling, that is, telepathic contact. Apparently, I am not the only one interested in Yahweh. The Russians are using this drug in experiments on slave labor. They want to induce states of automatic obedience and literal thought control. The basic con: no build-up, no routine, just move in on someone's psyche and give orders. The deal is certain to backfire because telepathy is not of its nature a one-way setup or a setup of sender and receiver at all. I decided to go down to Colombia and score for Yahweh. Bill Gaines is squared away with old Ike. My wife and I are separated. I'm ready to move on south and look for the uncut kick that opens out instead of narrowing down like junk. Kick is seeing things from a special angle. Kick is a momentary freedom from the claims of the aging, cautious, nagging, frightened flesh. Maybe I will find in Yahweh what I was looking for in junk and weed and coke. Yahweh may be the final fix. That sounds like a bizarre sermon at the end.
Well, because you kept saying Yahweh, yeah.
Well, that does help. Kick is a momentary freedom from the claims of the aging, cautious, nagging, frightened flesh. It's the clearest sentence, I think, about the promise of junk.
Yeah, going back to my original point. I don't mean to sound like that, but my original question, like, what the hell kind of book is this, or what what is the character arc, right? It's you could almost say it's the story of him trying to get off of drugs, or he gets hooked and he's trying to get off and find it. But you don't really get a sense in the beginning of why he even tried it, aside from boredom, until the very end there, where he talks about the thing I was looking for with junk. Maybe I'll find it in Yahweh. And it was like, okay, he was looking for something, but he doesn't mention it in the beginning of the book. I went back and I'm reading him going, no, there's no mention of why he wanted to do it. There is a line in there from the jazz musician Rodney King talking about heroin. It was the thing that said, we know, you don't know. It was the thing that gave us membership in a unique club. And for that membership, we gave up everything else in the world, which is this idea of the levels of cool. Like, okay, yeah, you can smoke your marijuana, you can smoke your reefer cigarettes and think you're cool, but those really cool cats are shooting heroin. That sort of hierarchy among the drug users, which maybe that was, Burroughs experimenting or seeking or checking stuff out. But anyway, you get finally in that last sentence, you kind of get that, he was looking for something.
Yeah. So if we were workshopping this, all right, like add that note earlier so it'll resonate more.
Make his motivation clear. What was his inciting incident? Yeah. To get, I come at things very structurally and very like, how do the mechanics and the gears work? And I want to understand. And yeah, I would be yelling at him to clarify this in the beginning or cut it out of the end. But
well, I think it's brilliant at the end, but yeah, it connects, I think, to the other Beat Generation writers with just an essential dissatisfaction of American life as everyone knew it at the time.
And searching for something
more, and looking at, Jack looked at America and said, there has to be something more than what I'm seeing.
And he found it.
Let me go see everything.
He found it on his first trip. It was apple pie with ice cream. And then he just kept looking for stuff. I'm like, he found it right away and on the road. Sorry to ruin the book for everybody. No.
I remember it a little
Chapter
bit differently.
2.
I remember it a little bit differently. All right, so I suppose I should get a longer microphone cord so that people can ask questions or make comments. Can you see the longer cord behind me?
Oh, that one.
Yeah, there we go.
While we're waiting on that, I will talk about my 2 pages of notes really quickly. There's a lot of stuff, having read other Burroughs novels, Naked Lunch, I really like The Wild Boys, I really like The Cities of the Red Night and things. There's a lot of themes or ideas or bits that come up in Junky that maybe only get a line or two kind of in their very just raw, almost embryonic state, that then becomes a much bigger deal or a much more evolved idea or concept later in his work. There's a junkie that he's dealing with in Junky named Bill Gaines, who is able to shoot up heroin without a needle, or the morphine without a needle, because he's such an established junkie that he just takes the eyedropper or the dropper with the morphine in it and brings it to the sore, and the sore almost opens up to accept the junk. And that it's a very small moment. It's just 2 lines in Junky, but later on in Naked Lunch and his other stories, it really evolves to where the junkie is just covered with orifices, really, sometimes mouths, sometimes assholes, but these things that will literally just absorb whatever their fix is or whatever their drug is, in a kind of body horror kind of way. Which is why we talk about, Naked Lunch is hard to read for some people, because it's like, there's lots of interesting stuff like that going on. There's a lot about the junk transforming your cells from being human cells to being junk dependent cells. So there's this idea of a biological change in a sort of physiological way that by the time you get to Naked Lunch and you get into the other books, there are certain drugs that literally will change you into a centipede, that literally will change you into a mugwump or these other creatures. You physically become something else, which gets very science fiction-y, very supernatural, fantastical. There's another word I'm trying to think of, but yeah, that aspect. So there's lots of little things like that lead into his later work or get developed later on. All right, you get your microphone set?
Finish your notes.
Oh, I wasn't going to go too into it, but there's the body horror aspect that he's really into. There's the drugs that will have magical powers. There's always like kind of at the end, the Yahé, he's chasing after Yahé. There'll be these rumored drugs that can cure you of addiction, that can, instantly do this, almost like a sci-fi drug that will take you to another level or change you into something else. And then you get that idea of government control or mystical control or some evil entity from another dimension trying to control you and alter your life, down to junk itself being a sentient creature that infects your body and takes you over almost like a parasite. So yeah, these are just things that develop that are briefly mentioned in Junky and then really come out in his later works. But it was interesting, having read that stuff, to see that it almost in the embryonic state within Junky. All right.
Can you drag this out?
If anybody has any questions. Doesn't?
Comments?
See, now they all feel obligated. Oh, sorry.
More broadly, though, you mentioned that this dissatisfaction with American life, is that something that happens repetitively in literature and in film? And was that in line with where it was happening culturally for that generation, such as early or late 20th century? That happened a lot in cinema. We had that dissatisfaction. So was that a wave that was occurring?
It was definitely occurring in the Beat generation, yeah, with Kerouac and Burroughs and Ginsberg and things and the others, it usually writers, there's almost two types of writers. There are the writers that are, kind of for the system, everything is good, and these are stories of how wonderful the system works, and these are our heroes. And then there's the people that are like, everything doesn't really work. Like, it works for you because you're in power and you've got the control or whatever, or you're healthy, or you're the dominant gender or whatever. But for us, it's kind of shitty. So it's, in a broad sweeping term, yeah, that's what most literature is. There's always going to be that undercurrent for every generation of, hey, stuff is not as squeaky clean as you like it. But for the 1950s that get romanticized for being wonderful and perfect and a great time, yeah, the Beat Generation were the ones saying like, no, it's not. They were very proto-punk, proto-hippies. Like, they were before the hippies, before the punks, before, gangster rap, before just all this disaffected stuff that came later. Yeah. If you want more examples, I'm sure we could go into it, but did you? Oh. I like that. I like having the microphone and you not having the microphone.
I think we just learned something about Matt.
Power.
Right, the big event happening at about the same time the Beat Generation are started to get together and starting to write their work. World War II ended, which is this glorious moment of just this horrible thing. We survived this horrible thing, and now we can build the perfect country with all of the resources and all of the people, and the war has stopped. Maybe the harm will just stop hemorrhaging, and the Beat Generation could look at that and go, your ideas are horrible. Like, your paradise is my hell. Like, if you're saying, okay, we just need to clean things up a bit and then everything will be perfect. Women, go back home, stop working. African Americans know where you're supposed to live. Gay people, you don't exist.
No more integration. From the integration of World War II.
Yeah, and the Beat Generation could look at that and say, okay, your ideal is my hell. And so I think you could track that, like, for each different movement. And, like, it happens in probably once a generation, but this isn't necessarily mainstream. I think one of the things that destroyed Kurt Cobain was everybody loving him. Like, I think he thought, I am pretty good, people should like me, like my music. But when the people who are the system that he hates love his music, culturally left him with nothing. I don't know if Jack Kerouac becoming the voice of his generation did him any favors in terms of how he coexisted with the culture he lived in. And I think Burroughs was maybe like the most outrageous outsider in that group of outsiders, where, he could just see on a systemic level, your paradise is rotten. Like Jack Kerouac, straight. And it's like, okay, give him a baseball game. He's happy. Take him into a normal bar. He could probably make himself happy if nobody fucks with him. And William S. Burroughs, like, for him to feel great, the number of requirements he would have to enjoy himself. Matt was making fun of, like, there's a picture of, was it Kerouac and Ginsberg at the beach?
Yeah.
And Burroughs is, and they're in bathing suits, and Burroughs is in a full suit, playing in the sand, like laying on the sand in his suit.
It looks like he woke up in the sand.
Yeah.
He looks like a homeless guy sleeping on the beach. Passed out. Yeah, passed out on the beach in Tangier. Sorry to stick you to the microphone. But yeah, you kind of get that with every generation. I mean, even Hemingway and Fitzgerald from the Lost Generation, they were the Lost Generation because World War I fucked them up so much and traumatized them all. And then between them and the Beats, you've got whatever Henry Miller and Anais Nin were, right, of that sort of post-modernist.
They were the Lost Generation, the sequel.
The sequel. They were the Loster Generation. And I'm sure even going back, you could go back look at Dickens. Most of Dickens' work is like, I'm going to show you posh motherfuckers how awful everything is for the people who are your servants or the people who are outside of your system. So it's always kind of there. Does that answer your question at all?
It does.
Okay.
Do you think structurally that that makes the writing a little bit easier whether it's the in crowd or the out crowd can be easily, you can put your thumb on it easy, so then you can move on from there and go into the details of what we're kind of rebelling against?
It definitely helps to know what you're pissed off about. I just want to say writing's never easy. It's fucking miserable. Ask John, who I've been harassing for his next book for years now, and my books that are just never coming out. But if I guess the old joke is getting to your doctorate or your thesis, and they tell you, don't write your thesis about something you love, write your thesis about something you hate, because you're going to need that energy to sustain you to finish your damn thesis. I think with a novel, like, you really have to care about what you're doing. You really have to care about what you're showing or what you're revealing to see it through, because it is such a long, arduous process. And multiple drafts. With my students, the biggest disappointment I see for them is where I tell them they need to write at least 4 drafts of a 90 or 110,000 word novel, because it just needs those layers to be as good as it is. Like, I can't just write a first draft and be done. And like, no, your first draft of 25,000 words is not a novel. I'm sorry. So it is that level of work that goes into it that I think stops a lot of people from doing it. But if you know what you're ticked off about, and you know what you're trying to show or do, it would make it a little bit easier and give you some direction. But I don't know how often writers know that, because a lot of writing is the discovery of finding out what the hell you want to say. And after you write your 90,000 words and you read it, you go, oh, that's what I was pissed off about. But I don't know how often writers know that, because a lot of writing is the discovery of finding out what the hell you want to say. And after you write your 90,000 words and you read it, you go, oh, that's what I was pissed off about.
Like that wonderful thesis about the kick at the end of Junky. Like it's the last bit of the book, and it's like, oh, that could have been on page 1. And it would have given a forward tilt to everything in the book, but he didn't. So there's the reaction to the world you live in. We could say the American system, if you're an American writer. The American government, and plus whatever law enforcement is doing, which may or may not be related to what the government is doing, plus whatever your neighbors expect out of you or demand of you, whatever your family demands of you, however the people at the bar are going to demand of you. And then there's just trying to live your life. And, they're depending on where you live, people might leave you alone, or you might be elbow to elbow with a bunch of other people. So I think, maybe certainly more than Jack Kerouac, Burroughs was interested in the system and trying to see the system. And yet, in Junky, the system only appears in certain points where things go very wrong, or, he's been arrested or he's in treatment. And you can see how the people around him don't even understand what they're dealing with, and often feel completely confident that they do understand everything that they're dealing with. So I think there's that tension probably in most great literature and stories that matter to us is, all right, what do you personally feel? What are you personally going for? And also, what are the social systems around us that are influencing us and influencing everyone around us that may be really problematic? And sometimes that could become explicit, and sometimes it's in the background. Like 1984, all right, that's in the foreground. Okay, the way that system works, like that's mostly what the book is about. But Winston Smith lusts. There are some things that aren't completely about the system until the system observes too much of him. And then he can't be a person anymore in the way that we would probably want to define what it means to be a person. So, I think it radically changes. There's a whole lot of punk rock that's just angry and, like doesn't have much more to convey other than fuck you, mom. And then there's punk where it's like, no, these people have read Marx that like, and they've studied poetry. Like they actually have a lot of thought going on. And I'm not saying the less thoughtful punk isn't sometimes great, but overall, like you could definitely see like, no, it's a continuum. How clearly we engage with the systems around us.
Right. From the non-American point of view, what would Burroughs be doing now? If he was writing now, what would he be angry about, do you think?
The same shit.
No, really. I mean, he doesn't have to be a suppressed gay person anymore. There's pride marches and everything. Or would he just be angry at a system which is, once again, seemingly the economy of this country is doing well but letting everyone down? Would he be angry about that?
It's always hard to tell with Burroughs because his politics are really hard to nail down. Mostly it evolved to leaving me the hell alone. So anything that was infringing upon his ability to do whatever the hell he wanted is what he's going to be mad at. Again, that's I hadn't thought about that. There's a curveball question like, he had the last year of his life, and the last thing he wrote, he kind of seemed to get some peace and realized that actual emotional love was valuable, and he called it the greatest or the best painkiller what there is. For some reason, he wrote what there is. But also he was really old and about to die. So, but it's a lot of the same shit that, classism, sexism, racism, homophobia, not being, anybody being different from the norm gets ostracized or put down upon or picked on or alienated from, or not alienated, but excluded from the bounty, the benefits. Specifically, somebody fucking with his cats would piss him off. I don't know. John?
That would piss him off a lot. Yeah, I think after a certain point, Burroughs, like, if we want to talk about the system, like the systems of power, I imagine he would be looking at it not in a very narrow sense. And like whatever label you want to put on him is not going to be adequate. Like, is he a Democrat? Like, he would see the Democrats as fairly indistinguishable, I think, from Republicans. Liberal, and it's like hard to say. So when Matt said the same shit, like I think like I think his conception of abusive system was so huge, that you would look at, some of the political horribleness of America in our time, and he would just say, told you. Like the thing I was talking about, like it's a little more visible now, but that is what the system looks like. That is not the system failing. That is your system. Yeah. That's my guess. But if he were in the room, he would tell me to shut the fuck up because I don't know what I'm talking about. That's my guess.
He'd say, show me your arms. Yeah. He was writing about transsexual and trans species characters. He'd probably be pissed about the exclusion and harassment of the furry community. Just because he was into whatever you wanted to do, whatever you liked, that's your pleasure and go for it as long as you're not hurting anybody else with it.
So he's one step off Aleister Crowley. Is that what I'm thinking of? Do what thou wilt?
Possibly. I'm not familiar enough with Crowley to beyond the metaphysical cocaine womanizer. Yeah. Good guy to party with. No, I don't.
I haven't tracked down what he thinks about Crawley, but I imagine he would see Crawley as being a little infantile. But then again, almost anyone who might share an opinion with Burroughs, I think he would find a reason why, like, they don't understand.
Crawley's too focused on this planet and this plane. He lacks imagination. We're talking interdimensional, time-traveling wild boys ready to rip down the system.
So there's an incident in the life of Aleister Crowley where he was a member of a cult group called the Order of the Golden Dawn. And apparently he got into fisticuffs with William Butler Yeats, who was also in that same organization. So I really would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that spat, whatever that was. But that kind of led to Aleister Crowley deciding, okay, I can just make my own church. I don't need to belong to the Order of the Golden Dawn. So yeah, this is Junky, which is William of Burroughs's readable novel. Structurally, it's probably closer to a picaresque, which is just one thing happened and then another thing happened and then we went over here and then that happened and then another thing happened.
But involving drugs and crime.
Yeah, and there are themes involved, and I think he covers like so much ground and, describing heroin addiction and just all the variations of experience and entailing that. And we definitely get hints that he may become a lot stranger. Yeah.
And then the next book, Queer, is also very straightforward and, well, not straight, but
queer forward.
It's very readable and has a narrative and has a plot that you can, or sequence of events that you can follow. We're saying this because literally when you get to Naked Lunch, he was telling the editors and Ginsberg, just put it in any order. It doesn't matter. Right. And kind of bookended up all these just random scenes of chaos and debauchery with basically like a short story that was split in two for the first and last chapter. So that's when we're talking about, it has a linear narrative. That's kind of what we're getting at. And then Interzone, of course, starts off being rather readable and then deteriorates into a rambling rant that is wonderful, but it's much more like just somebody going off than an actual story.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for the inaugural installment of the Kerouac Project Book Club.